What if I told you this isn't just about one leader anymore? This isn't just about one country anymore. Something bigger is happening, quietly but very fast. Around the world, leaders are no longer reacting. They're repositioning, they're adjusting, and in some cases, they're moving on. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Donald Trump, that's not the point of this video. The real story is this: the global system itself is changing. And for the first time in decades, the United States is not at the center of every decision. Today, I'm going to show you what leaders in Canada are openly saying, why Europe is making massive strategic shifts, how new alliances are forming without the US, and the one move happening right now that could redefine global power. Because this might be the moment the world stopped waiting. The shift has started for decades. Global politics followed a very familiar pattern. Whenever a crisis emerged anywhere in the world, whether it was economic instability, military tension, or diplomatic conflict, most countries instinctively turned toward Washington. They looked to the United States for direction. They waited for signals. They coordinated their next moves based on what America decided to do. This wasn't just about power. It was about predictability. There was a system in place, a rhythm, an understanding that, regardless of the situation, there was a central point of leadership guiding the broader international response. And for a long time, that system worked. But now, that pattern is beginning to break. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. Not through one single event, but gradually, quietly, and most importantly, consistently. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, leaders are starting to think differently. They're asking a question that, until recently, many wouldn't even consider. What if America is no longer predictable? And that question changes everything. Because in global politics, predictability isn't just a preference. It's a form of security. When countries can anticipate how a major power will respond, they can plan, they can align strategies, they can reduce risk. But when that predictability fades, uncertainty takes its place. And uncertainty is something no nation is comfortable with. Because uncertainty doesn't just create confusion, it creates vulnerability. It forces countries to consider worst-case scenarios, to prepare for outcomes they can't fully control. And in that kind of environment, waiting becomes dangerous. Hesitation becomes costly. So instead of waiting, countries begin to adapt. They start building backup plans. They diversify their alliances. They invest in their own capabilities. They explore new partnerships, sometimes with countries they previously kept at a distance. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to rely less on any single global leader. This doesn't mean the United States suddenly becomes irrelevant. Far from it. But it does mean something subtle, yet very important, is changing. The automatic assumption of leadership is no longer automatic. And once that shift begins, it doesn't easily reverse, because trust, once questioned, is rarely restored overnight. So what we're seeing right now is not a sudden collapse of the old system. It's something more complex, a slow transition from a world that depended on one central power to a world where multiple players are preparing to stand on their own. And that transition is already underway. Canada speaks out. Let's start with Canada, a country that, for decades, has been one of the United States' closest and most reliable allies. This isn't just about geography. It's about history, shared values, deep economic ties, and one of the longest peaceful borders in the world. For years, the relationship between the two countries has been defined by cooperation, trade agreements, security partnerships, mutual trust, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of stability. But recently, something has started to feel different. The tone coming from Canadian leadership is no longer as quiet or as cautious as it once was. It's becoming more direct, more public, and noticeably more assertive. Instead of handling disagreements behind closed doors, which is typically how close allies operate, we're now seeing moments of open criticism. Statements that would have once been carefully softened are now being delivered more plainly, and not just on minor issues. We're talking about concerns related to trade decisions, economic pressure, and broader political unpredictability. And that shift in tone matters, because in diplomacy, how something is said is often just as important as what is being said. When allies start speaking more openly, more bluntly, it usually reflects something deeper beneath the surface. Allies don't just change their tone for no reason. There's usually a buildup, a series of moments, a growing sense that the old way of managing the relationship is no longer working. And when that point is reached, the language changes, becomes sharper, less filtered, more public, because the message is no longer just meant for private negotiation. It's meant to be heard, understood, and sometimes to send a signal. Now, this doesn't mean the relationship between Canada and the United States is collapsing. Far from it. These are still two countries with deep interconnected interests. But what it does suggest is that the level of comfort within that relationship may be shifting. Because diplomacy, at its core, is usually careful, measured, calculated. Leaders choose their words very deliberately. They avoid unnecessary escalation. They prioritize stability. So when that careful tone starts to fade, when statements become more direct, more emotionally charged, it often points to frustration, a sense that concerns are not being addressed in the way they once were. And in some cases, it can even hint at something more serious, a gradual loss of confidence, not necessarily a complete breakdown, but a subtle change in how one ally views the reliability of the other. And in international politics, even small shifts in perception can have large consequences. Because once doubt enters the equation, countries begin to adjust. They become more cautious, more independent, more willing to explore alternatives. And that's what makes this moment worth paying attention to. Because it may not be loud, it may not dominate headlines every day, but it's part of a broader pattern, one where even the closest allies are starting to rethink how they engage and what they can truly rely on moving forward. Europe's biggest move yet. Now let's talk about Europe, because this is where things start to get serious. Up until now, you could argue that some of these global shifts were subtle, easy to overlook. But in Europe's case, the changes are too big to ignore, because Europe isn't just talking anymore. Europe is acting, and not in small ways. Right now, multiple European nations are making some of the most significant strategic adjustments we've seen in decades. We're talking about real, measurable moves, massive increases in defense spending, long-term military planning that doesn't rely as heavily on outside support, and even early steps toward building financial systems that operate independently of U.S. influence. Now, none of this is happening by accident. This isn't a sudden reaction. It's a calculated shift, a deliberate effort to redefine how Europe positions itself in a changing world. For a long time, the structure was simple. The United States played a central role in European security. Through alliances, military presence, and coordination, there was a shared understanding: America leads and Europe aligns. But today, that model is being quietly reworked, not abandoned completely, but adjusted, refined, step by step, decision by decision. European leaders are asking themselves a difficult but necessary question. What happens if we can't always depend on the same level of support? And instead of waiting for an answer, they're preparing for it. That's why we're seeing discussions, and in some cases, real progress, in areas that were once considered untouchable. For example, there's growing interest in creating alternatives to US-based payment systems, not to replace them overnight, but to ensure that Europe has options. There's also a noticeable push to reduce reliance on American technology. From software to infrastructure, the idea is simple. If critical systems are controlled externally, they can become a vulnerability. And then there's the focus on strengthening internal European industries, keeping production closer to home, investing in domestic capabilities, building supply chains that are more resilient and less exposed to external pressure. Now, none of this means Europe is turning away from the United States completely. That would be an oversimplification. The relationship is still there. The cooperation still exists. But what is changing is the level of dependence, because dependence creates risk, and risk is something governments try to minimize. especially in uncertain times. That's why this shift matters, because it reflects a broader mindset change, from reliance to resilience, from assumption to preparation, and ultimately, from shared control to strategic independence. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really about: control. The ability to make decisions without being constrained, the ability to respond without waiting, the ability to act in your own interest, on your own timeline, and in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. That kind of control becomes incredibly valuable, because control creates stability. And right now, that's exactly what Europe is trying to secure. The rise of new power centers. While all of this is happening, something else is quietly emerging. New centers of power, not one dominant leader, but multiple. You have Europe becoming more unified strategically, China expanding its global economic influence, Middle Eastern countries forming flexible partnerships, and smaller nations becoming more assertive. This is what experts call a multipolar world, where power is shared, distributed, and constantly shifting. And in a multipolar world, no country can rely on old assumptions. Everything becomes more dynamic, more competitive, more unpredictable. The unexpected player. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Ukraine, a country many expected to collapse quickly, has instead become one of the most important players in modern warfare. Not because of size, but because of adaptation. Ukraine has rapidly developed advanced drone warfare, defensive technologies, real-time battlefield innovation, and this has caught the world's attention because modern war is changing, and Ukraine is showing how. For many countries, this isn't just about supporting Ukraine, it's about learning from it. Economic realignment. But this shift isn't just military, it's economic. Countries are starting to rethink where they invest, who they trade with, which systems they depend on. We're seeing early signs of alternative payment networks, regional trade partnerships, reduced dependence on single economies. Because here's the reality: economic power is just as important as military power, and nations want flexibility, not dependency. Alliances are changing. Here's the part most people don't fully realize. Alliances are not permanent. They evolve, they shift, they adapt to new realities. Right now, we're seeing countries build relationships with each other without waiting for U.S. leadership. That doesn't mean alliances are ending, but it does mean they are being redefined, more balanced, more independent, more conditional. What this means. So what does all of this actually mean? It means we are entering a different kind of world, a world where power is shared, influence is negotiated, and leadership is not guaranteed. It also means decisions will become more complex, more layered, and sometimes more unstable, because when no single power dominates, competition increases. The big question. So here's the real question. Is this a temporary shift or a permanent transformation? Because if this trend continues, we may be witnessing the beginning of a completely new global era, not defined by one leader, not controlled by one country, but shaped by many. And whether you see that as a risk or an opportunity, one thing is clear: the world is not standing still. It's moving, fast, and everyone is adjusting. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to subscribe, because we don't just follow the headlines here, we explain what they actually mean.